Mr. Pramod Kumar Singh, Senior Director, Research and Programs at Alliance for an Energy Efficient Economy. Pramod Kumar Singh has 18 years of clean energy research and programs management experience supporting the government, the private sector, international development agencies, and private sector international development agencies, philanthropies. He has led projects related to energy efficiency, renewable energy, climate change, and power in Asia, North America, and Europe. He is part of the senior leadership team and currently manages all the research.
Prior to Alliance for an Energy Efficient Economy, he was leading the Advanced Technologies objective of USAID's South Asia Regional Energy Partnership Program. He has also led USAID's South Asia Regional Energy Hub Program as the chief of party. His other associations include working with the ICF International, Schatz Energy Research Centre, and Indian Oil Corporation Limited. Today, Mr. Pramod will talk about demand-side management in smart grids. So let's welcome Mr. Pramod.
Thank you, Sachi. Thank you, Madhuri, for having me for this webinar. I'm particularly that we are starting a session on smart grids by talking about demand-side management. They say that we don't have to worry about generation, transmission, distribution, and storage of electricity, which can be avoided through energy efficiency. It's the cheapest, fastest, and cleanest way to decarbonize the power sector. And so I have a few slides, Sachi, that I'll present for the benefit of the audience, and that can lay the context for the discussion that I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on demand flexibility. What is demand flexibility? What's the need for it? How it contributes towards smart grid? What kind of green shoots that we see in terms of the policy initiatives, in terms of regulations, and in terms of pilot projects that India as a country has been pursuing so far. But more importantly, what is it required to scale it up? So a basic concept on demand flexibility, many of the participants might have heard about what is demand response. There is a fundamental difference between demand response and demand flexibility, and I'll explain it in a minute. Definition-wise, it's the ability of a customer to deviate from its normal electricity consumption pattern, whether it's the quantity of consumption or it's the timing of consumption, in response to external signals. The signals could be in terms of price, tariff, it could be something like an obligation required from the customers, but anything that affects the quantity and timing falls under demand flexibility. Now, how it's different from the traditional demand response is number one, demand response was often talked about in the context of peak demand. Whenever the system was under stress because of unforeseen demand, then the demand response events were called for. However, demand flexibility is not necessarily limited to peak demand situation. This is something one can need any time of the day. If there is a drop in renewable generation or there is an outage in the system, even if there is no peak demand situation, there is a stress on the grid, and one needs to have then demand flexibility come into picture. That's one difference. The second difference is it's not only about reduction. It's not only about reducing your demand. Sometimes in response to the grid condition, customer also needs to increase its demand. So that's where demand flexibility can operate both sides, a reduction as well as increase. And timing-wise, it can work 24 hours, not limited to only peak demand. Now, there are different strategies under demand flexibility. One can look at reduction, so that's called as shed. One can look at altering the shape, that's more permanent in nature. Shifting demand to times where renewable is high or where price of electricity is lower. And then the last part, which is the interesting piece, it's modulating your demand depending on the situation. It's like making the demand really flexible. For instance, we are operating our air conditioners, let's say at 25 degrees centigrade. We see that so many customers, because of the current situation, all are using AC, our transformers are tripping all the time. If we increase the set point from 26 degree to 27, 28 degree, that will reduce stress on the grid. That's making your demand flexible. And if all of the customers do it in a planned way, then it will provide relief to the grid. That's one example. Similarly, if you are charging your vehicle, so many electric vehicles are now getting added to the system. How they are charging it, what time of the day, and at what charging rate, that will also provide flexibility to the grid. So I'll not go into the definitions, but fundamental wise, this is demand flexibility. Now, what's the need for it? Number one, we see how peak demand has grown last 12 years from 120 to 203 gigawatt. The projections are that in the next 10 years until 2032, it's going to increase at 6% CAGR every year, 6%. So the peak demand is going to increase almost 80% from the 2021-22 level. When it comes to consumption, it's going to also increase almost at a similar rate. But what's going to make the grid more complex is the addition of variable renewable capacity. Today, as a country, we are somewhere close to 170, 180 non-fossil capacity, of which solar and wind comprising the bulk. It's expected, if we go by government's plan and India's commitment, that India is going to add 430 gigawatt solar and wind by 2032. Now, what's going to happen? That in terms of the actual electrons, in terms of the electricity, this is going to comprise almost 27 to 30% of the electricity mix. That's a whole lot of variable electricity that will be a part of the system. And that's where all the questions related to grid reliability, the quality of power supply will come into picture. We also are seeing, despite renewables getting added, the overall cost of electricity is on the rise. So how the electricity becomes affordable to customers, it's also important. If we add more batteries to the system, if we make our... So demand flexibility is also another way to optimize not only the supply mix and adding more renewables, but also how to make the grid more affordable to customers. On the right-hand side, I've just presented a case from Delhi, because I'm from Delhi, that if we look at one of the DISCOMs, BYPL, then only for 1% of the time in a year, so in a year there are 8760 hours, and for 88 hours, we see 190 megawatt incremental demand in the system. If this demand has to be met from the supply side, then imagine generation that will meet this demand, all the network that needs to be set up both on the transmission, distribution side, all of those infrastructure needs to be laid out. The question is, can demand flexibility come to the rescue and help avoid this 190 megawatt while making the supply reliable and affordable to the customer? And we have been a part of several projects. India has done several projects. It's proven elsewhere also that demand flexibility is one of the cost-effective options to manage this scenario. Now, looking at globally, there is an outlook published by IEA which says that in order to meet the net zero scenario, overall world needs about 500 gigawatt of demand response. That's almost 10 times compared to where the world is in 2021. And there are several countries which are doing demand response, demand flexibility at a very big scale. So they have gone beyond pilots and it has become mainstream. Australia being one example where it's part of the wholesale market. Belgium, it's part of the capacity market. US, we see different kind of integration. It's part of the energy market. It's part of the ancillary services market. It's part of the capacity and resource adequacy market. So there are plenty of examples, not just in last 5 years, but proven over a decade, which gives us the confidence that this too can be implemented in India. Now let's look at what are some of the drivers of demand flexibility in India. So over last 3 or 4 years, we are finding increasingly, in fact, not a single document I've seen which doesn't give reference to demand response. And why I'm saying demand response, because in India, demand flexibility, demand response sometimes are used interchangeably. And if you look at these documents, they cover four main attributes. One that is related to use cases. Now, till 10 years back, our main objective was to meet the peak demand, to help us get out from the deficit situation. Now the objectives are also complex. We want to meet the demand, we want to meet it in a cost effective manner, we also want to make sure that it's being met through green electricity. So there are several use cases, how demand flexibility can help reduce cost, how it can enable more renewable, how it helps in network congestion relief, how it adds to the system reliability. These documents also refer to demand flexibility being used in different markets. It's not limited to wholesale market or ancillary market. There are DSM regulations adopted by more than 30 states and UTs that talk about demand side management, part of the retail supply also. The third important attribute is related to levers. So it's not only through tariffs, but direct load control is another lever through which demand flexibility can happen. Incentives and likewise penalties are also being talked about. So that's another lever. How do you force certain customers the way, if I take example, let's say power factor was enforced through penalty. Similarly, how demand response obligations can be mandated. And then the fourth thing is through business models. Whether utility will be doing it on their own, or there is just scope to involve intermediaries, the like of aggregators, and in what mechanism, whether it will be through a fixed cost basis or one can do it based on a success fee, based on the value that demand response will generate. So some kind of a bidding process. So these are different attributes being talked about in various government documents. And now the time is, how do we work towards implementing it at scale? That's the next objective. In this slide, I've presented a few pilot programs. I'm sure there might be a number of more programs which could have been missed in this list. But interestingly, you see that both a mix of public and private utilities have tried their hands with pilot. And the objective was not only reduction to peak demand. There are examples where demand flexibility was used to manage renewable because there was a deviation between what was the schedule planning versus the actual. Some of these programs adopted manual intervention, others used for automated. Automated always has an upper edge because it adds to the certainty. You know at what time, what quantity you are likely to get. So it will help in the resource planning. And then some of these pilots were not limited to commercial and industrial. One would think that these are easier segments to work with because of average ticket size. Residential customers are fragmented, hard to manage, but we also have to realize that in India, C&I customers are cross-subsidizing other customers. So it's a utilities cash cow, and they may not be really keen to go for any intervention that may potentially lead to decrease in revenues, which also, by the way, is a myth. If we plan it holistically, then overall it increases the value and margins of discounts, but we are trying to work towards that. And then in terms of the targeted appliance, some of the programs focused at the entire facility, whereas others were very targeted, looking at appliances or equipment. As a country, we have experience on number of pilots. Now, here are some recommendations based on AEEE's work in this area, my personal experience. That number one, it's not about technology. technology has been demonstrated. If not in case of demand response, then maybe some other sectors. There are sensors, there are IoT devices. They are likely to work with a very high degree of confidence. I think going forward, the program should be designed which has an element of regulatory push and how it can be replicated at scale. That's very important. The second part, which we have seen across various projects globally also, that all investments in demand flexibility can be justified. It will exceed the cost, definitely will exceed the savings. We have done projects where the payback is less than 2.5 to less than 3 years. And in terms of a benefit cost ratio, it exceeds 1 if there is a critical mass of customers available. If we try and bring in more revenue streams, then it will become even further attractive. However, where we lack is when I was showing about different regulations, policies, I think more awareness is required, both utilities and ERCs, that there are provisions available and they need to work towards taking pilots to a scalable program. The other takeaway is that it's not limited to only power distribution company. We understand that it's the most important link. Discoms have a role to play, but when it comes to demand flexibility, in addition to Discoms, SLDCs, RLDCs, transmission companies can also be the buyer because they are also into similar service of maintaining grid stability, making sure that there is no congestion. And we already see that as part of CERC's ancillary regulation for tertiary reserve, there is a provision for LDCs to procure demand response services. Then coming to markets, it's not limited to energy. I think we should look at more and more capacity market because the value of capacity avoidance is far more than the value that it generates for energy. And the last 2 points are related to looking at new business models. I think aggregators are going to play an important role because they will do the hard work of customer recruitment, making sure that customers are being compensated and bringing all those volumes. Demand response, whether through a fixed fee or through bidding, this will be a part of market development process, which only time will tell. But I think there is a need to create the market, and initially maybe a model that's acceptable to private players need to be thought through. And last point is when it comes to residential customers, which are going to be very important segment, how do we look at platforms that can aggregate those demands? That's very essential. And the messaging is not only in terms of what's the incentives they're going to get, but also relating it to the larger life mission, our Prime Minister's clarion call on how customers can contribute towards society and towards green. That's going to be very important. So with this, Sachi, I'll stop and I'll pass it on to you. Happy to answer any questions now or later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pramod, for sharing your views on demand side management in smart grids.